This is the scariest episode from my childhood. It took place in 1991, when I was 8 years old. I lived in a village on the Norwegian countryside, with my parents and 2 older brothers. There weren't many kids around for us to play with, so we always stuck together, despite the age difference. I was 8, my brothers 10 and 12. It was a safe neighborhood and we were really outdoorsy kids. It was fine for us just to return home and eat, and then go back out again and play in the woods or go fishing in the nearby lake. In autumn of 1991, my oldest brother dared us to sneak through the hedge to the abandoned property that was located close by. We had always thought of it as a haunted house, but really it was just an old house where the man who started the village brick factory once lived. No one had lived there for ages, and the paint was starting to peel off, and several of the windows were broken. Our parents would tell us never to go there. Their reason was, of course, they feared that we would get hurt playing there, but we thought it was because it was haunted. But that day we dared to walk around in the garden, and now had a dried up pond, an old well, and several old and dying fruit trees, and even tools in the old shed. It looked as if someone had just walked out one day and never returned, leaving everything as it was. We soon came to think of the garden as ours, and played there all the time. We climbed the trees, used the tools to build things. It was great, our very own secret playground. We suspected that people in the village had seen us, because soon our parents would ask us if we had gone there, despite it being strictly forbidden, which of course we denied, but someone must have complained. We were rather loud and untamed kids. Until one day in November. I remember since it was in the days before my birthday. It was a damp and rainy day, and we weren't really in the mood to play outside. But our mom had chased us out of the house, so she could clean in peace, and we weren't allowed back until an hour later. So we decided to try and open the old cellar. I'm not sure what the word is in English for this kind of cellar, but imagine, if you will, a hatch that opens almost horizontally to the ground, then a few steps that lead you down to a dugout cellar, with stone walls and a dirt floor. It was used to store vegetables and such, but it was empty now. All of us climbed down to have a look. The plan was to write our names in the inside of the cellar, as if to mark it as our own. Suddenly the hatch slammed shut above us, and the cellar became completely dark. I started screaming, and my older brothers tried to open the hatch. When my oldest brother, Sindri, pushed the hatch open, he saw a man's hand holding a small axe.
"Come on out, trespassing little brats,"
the voice growled, the axe close to the opening of the hatch. "Hell no," Sindri shouted back and slammed the hatch shut from the inside.
"All right, little brats. I know you're in there, all 3 of you little shits. Does your mommy know you're in there? Well, does she? I bet she doesn't. No one will look for you."
We heard him dropping the axe and start to move around with something else. Soon we realized that he had taken out a hammer, and before we knew it, he started to nail shut the hatch. I threw myself at the hatch, determined to get out, but the moment the hatch opened just a tiny bit, he reached for the axe again.
"Come on now, come on out. It's the better choice, really. It must be awfully dark and damp in there. Aren't you afraid of the dark? Go on, let your little brother out." Let him out.
He laughed, and we could all hear that he was drunk. My older brother Emil was pleading with the man to let us go, promising that we would never return, but his words fell on deaf ears. The rain had started to fall really heavily now, and we heard thunder outside. The drunk man with the hammer was cursing and moving around outside, clearly bothered by the bad weather.
"I might come back to let you out one day, or maybe I'll butcher all 3 of you,"
he whispered through the wooden door as he hammered the hatch shut. We were too terrified to do anything, but Sindri told us to keep calm and it would be okay, as he surely was just out to scare us. The dark was compact inside the cellar, and it was cold and damp. After a long while of silence from the man outside, we started to wonder if he had left. Sindri decided that we should count to 100 and then try to get out. We counted loudly and then used our hands to find the hatch. It was definitely nailed shut. Sindri then told us to feel around the stone walls for a loose stone, and we did, cutting our palms upon the sharp edges. Eventually we did find one, and it was surprisingly easy to remove from its place. The cellar was old and had not been tended to for ages, and the rainy climate of the Norwegian coast had left the wooden hatch doors rather soft with age. The cellar was built in such a way that it was almost impossible to get a good forward motion in order to break the wood, but fueled by panic and adrenaline, we broke the lower half open. Being closest to the ground, it was softer and easier to tear apart. We started digging with our hands, creating a small opening out. Being the smallest, my brothers pushed me out of the cellar, and I could see that the man was in fact gone. My brothers were too big to fit in the small opening, and Sindri said I would have to get the hammer and get the hatch open. I was absolutely petrified that the man would come back with the axe, and I would have to run, leaving my brothers to die, or stay and be slaughtered. At 8 years old, I had no doubt that that would have happened. I got the hammer, but I couldn't get the nails out, so I used the hammer to simply break the hatch into pieces. Soon we were all three running for dear life across the garden and to our house, where Mom threw a fit over the state of our clothes and hands and demanded to know what we have been up to. Nothing, we all lied, unsure of what to say. We never went back there again. We never even looked that way. The man with the axe? I have no idea who he was or where he came from. I wonder if he was just a drifter living in the abandoned house, not wanting noisy kids to disturb the peace. We've never told anyone about it, but every year, when Sindri, Emil, and I reunite at the family home for Christmas, we always ask if there's any news about the old ghost house down the street, and has anyone moved in there yet. This happened to me just over a week ago. I was driving north from DC to Massachusetts to visit my sister who had just had her first baby. It was about 9 p.m. when I crossed over the Delaware Bridge and made my way onto the New Jersey Turnpike. I was listening to NPR and sipping on an energy drink, traveling about 65 or 70 miles per hour in my rented Tucson when my cell phone started to ring. I've been pulled over and ticketed for driving while on my phone before, so I pulled my car over to the side of the road. I was about 13 miles north of the bridge, and directly to my right where I had pulled over was a warehouse of some kind, with a parking lot behind a chain-link fence. The property even had its own overpass extending over the road, so people traveling in the southbound lane could access it. I parked my car on the shoulder of the road and answered my phone, which turned out to be my mother, just checking up on my progress. She had already flown in from Florida to be with my sister during the birth, as well as to escape from Hurricane Irma. We spoke on the phone for perhaps 2 minutes before I told her that I would see her soon, and we hung up. I was about to put the car in drive and continue on my way when I caught something out of the corner of my eye to the right. Standing in the darkness directly on the other side of the chain-link fence was a man who appeared to be wearing a gas mask, staring right back at me. I squinted hard as I peered back at him through the darkness. There was some illumination from the overhead streetlights, and of course, there were the headlights from other cars, but I couldn't get a clear view of him. For the first several seconds, I was convinced that I was just hallucinating, because there was no way anyone could be wearing an old-fashioned World War II style gas mask in a parking lot late at night just staring at people in this day and age. After what felt like 30 seconds, I concluded that it had to be a prank, a pretty creepy one too. The guy had barely moved since I made eye contact with him. I cracked a smirk and waved towards him, but he seemed fully dedicated to the performance because he didn't acknowledge the wave. I started to chuckle and glanced down to pick up my phone back up off the passenger seat, intending to take a video of him. But when I raised my head and aimed the phone towards the fence, my heart literally skipped a beat as I saw the figure stomping across the grass right towards me, having apparently walked directly through the fence. I screamed as the figure raised something above his head. I'm not sure what it was, perhaps it was a pipe or a crowbar, but I didn't wait to find out. I put my car in drive and floored it out of there, speeding down the turnpike at almost 90 miles an hour. I didn't look behind me. I just kept driving flat out for about 2 minutes before I slowed back down to about 60 and tried to collect myself. I knew there hadn't been a gate at that part of the fence because I had been staring at it for a better part of a minute. Had there been a gate, I wouldn't have hung around. But what the hell just happened? If it was a ghost or something, it hadn't been transparent. It looked completely real. I pulled off the turnpike at the next rest stop and sat in my car, trying to make sense of it all. If it had been a prank, some kind of Chris Angel illusion, it had been amazing. But what really bothered me the most was I had taken my eyes off the figure for perhaps 3 seconds tops, just to pick up my phone and raise it. How had the figure in the mask known to move right when my eyes were averted? Could it really see me that well through the dark in a mask? And what were its intentions once it reached my car? I sat in silence in the car until my pulse returned to normal. I shook it off as best as I could and continued on my way. Needless to say, I never got a video. I never called the cops, or did any kind of investigating into the building or its history. Tomorrow night, I start driving back to DC, though I've decided to take a different route home. If you want to check out the building, feel free. Just don't blame me when you get arrested for trespassing, or attacked by a gas mask wearing maniac. I'm not going to share my name, age, or location. I'm not writing this to entertain you. I'm writing this because I want to know if anyone else has experienced this, and if so, what can I do to stop it? I live in a gated apartment complex where the buildings form a square around an inner courtyard. Inside the courtyard is a grassy lawn area with a playground for kids and picnic tables. About 2 years ago, I was sleeping peacefully one night when a bone-chilling scream started coming from somewhere outside from within the courtyard. It was a tortured scream, like someone was being burned alive. But honestly, my ears were ringing so badly, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard. That was just an educated guess. The screaming was almost non-stop, with barely detectable pauses where the person took a breath. I heard people from all around the apartment building stepping out onto their balconies, trying to figure out what was going on. I went to my window and glanced outside. There was no lights on in the courtyard, but at least one tenant was shining a flashlight down from a window above, trying to find the source of the screaming. Each building is 3 stories tall, and I live on the ground floor apartment directly across from the mailboxes and the entrance. So if and when the police arrived, I would be the first to encounter them when they made their way out to the courtyard. I left the window and ran down my hallway to the front door and looked out my peephole. I could hear the screaming, and it was making my blood freeze. It almost sounded like it had an echo behind it, like it was reverberating off the stone walls of a deep pit or a stone tunnel. But regardless, the ferocity behind it was the most terrifying thing about it. It sounded like some poor guy was having his limbs torn off. I waited by the door for perhaps 5 minutes. There was no signs of police sirens, and the screams never let up. From elsewhere in the apartment complex, I heard children crying and people yelling. One guy was screaming profanities, and I heard at least 2 other people down in the courtyard yelling. There was no way I was leaving the safety of my apartment. I stayed right where I was, waiting for the cops to arrive. Then suddenly the tone of the screaming changed. Something was happening. It started moving towards me. Whoever or whatever was wailing from outside was leaving the courtyard and heading in my direction. I felt my heart sink as the screaming grew louder, until it was echoing off the walls from the hallway outside my door. I pressed my hands over my ears and slid down the door, closing my eyes and praying for the screaming to stop. It was so loud, I felt the noise in my bones, like it was shaking my teeth. There came a frantic pounding at my door and I screamed, too terrified to stand up and glance through the peephole, afraid of what I might see. Then as soon as it started, it was over. I lay on my hallway floor sobbing, and my head was ringing from the noise. A crowd of people had gathered outside my door and were shouting at each other, demanding to know what had been going on. The police arrived about 5 minutes later, and after they had settled down the angry mob outside my door, there came a knock. Apparently, most of the other tenants assumed that either myself or somebody I knew was responsible. As the screaming had stopped right outside my door, I let the police search my apartment to prove to them that I wasn't hiding anyone. Then they took my statement. The courtyard was searched, and the security cameras were reviewed, but there wasn't any footage that showed anyone either leaving or entering. This has happened 5 more times since then, what I call the phantom screaming. There's no pattern as far as I could tell. There's no way to predict it. It starts in the dead of night, continues for several minutes, and always ends up right outside my door before it stops. Most of my neighbors blame me for it and hate me because they're convinced that there's some connection between the screaming and it always ending at my door. They claim that I've traumatized their children and have tried to get me evicted twice, but no concrete proof has ever come to light that I'm the one to blame. I've never tried to record the screaming, though I know plenty of other tenants have. Once, a man marched out into the courtyard when the screaming started and fired 3 shots from a handgun into the air, which didn't solve the problem and resulted in him being arrested. The first few times I was willing to write this off as a horrific joke, but after 6 times I concede. I believe it to be something paranormal, but not once has anyone ever spotted a figure entering the courtyard, even though security has been tightened. So, does anybody know what's going on? Does this thing want me, or connected somehow to my apartment? What do I do to fix it? Can I fix it? If anyone has any solutions, let me know. Even when the screaming isn't happening, I still lie awake at night sometimes in a cold sweat, because I can hear the tortured wails echoing in my head. Some of you may ask, why don't I ever look through the peephole? Well, I refuse to do that. In fact, I've covered the peephole with duct tape. I'm terrified at the notion of looking at this thing, whatever it is, directly in the eye. Before I tell my story, just know that I have this insane, irrational fear of looking out the window at night and seeing someone else staring back at me. It usually prevents me from looking out of windows when it's dark. Anyway, on with the story. This happened about 3 years ago. I was 15 at the time. It was late, around 12 a.m. My mom worked 3rd shift as a nurse. She's a single parent and I'm an only child, so I was always home alone late at night. No matter, I enjoyed the peace. My mother had recently lost the keys to the front door, so I would have to wake up early in the mornings and let her in. To stop myself from having to wake up and lose my oh-so-precious sleep, I would just leave the door unlocked. I lived in a small town in a nice neighborhood, and crime was never a serious discussion. But that night changed everything. I remember going into the kitchen, making a bowl of cereal and playing with my cats. I'm standing in the living room at this point, when I hear a scratching sound at the door. The wind was blowing that night, making all sorts of sounds outside, so I didn't really pay it any attention. For some reason though, I decided to eat my cereal over the sink, in the kitchen, only a few feet away from the front door. This is something I would normally never do. My cats, upon hearing the scratching sound, run to the door. I roll my eyes, thinking that they're no fun to play with, but the scratching sound continues. Then my stomach just drops. I can't even explain the feeling that I got. It was like my intestines just fell further down into my body. It was then I realized that it wasn't the wind making the scratching sound. I walked to the door and decided to peek through the blinds, just in case there would be someone out there. We had a French door with a glass window in the middle, with blinds covering the whole. I peeked through the blinds, and to my horror, I see the glimmering whites of 2 eyes staring back at me. I see the rugged exterior of a man's face, and the striking outline of his nose, the coy grin on his lips. But the eyes. I will never forget those eyes. I dropped my bowl, which shattered on the floor, and quickly turned the deadbolt. Just as there was a sudden crash on the other side, the man was trying to break in. I rammed my feet against the wall, practically laid down on top of the door, and was able to shut and lock the deadbolt. I locked myself in a closet, called the police, and then my mom. The police showed up but didn't find anything. Nobody knows who it was. The most terrifying thing is that I usually listen to my iPod on max volume. So this guy could have easily just walked into my house and harmed me in some way, and I would have never known that he was inside. My bedroom was also at the back of the house, far away from the front door. I usually can't even hear the doorbell when it rings, so I would have been done for if I hadn't taken my cereal over to the sink that night. The thought still makes me sick to this day. and I still can't look outside my window at night for fear of once again seeing those eyes staring back at me. A few years ago, me and a friend of mine were driving around the back roads of Nebraska. It was summer break, and out of boredom, we decided to drive around and look for some old abandoned buildings to explore. We had been driving for an hour or so, and we passed by a few houses already, but we thought we spotted a building or something in the trees, and as we got closer, we discovered it was a small shed, and just up the path from this shed was this small rundown house. It looked like the perfect place to explore. As we were pulling in, we noticed something lying in the middle of the driveway. It looked like an animal carcass. It looked to be some kind of pig. As we parked the car, we noticed that there was more animal carcasses surrounding the house, maybe around 15 to 20 of them, just lying in the yard around the house. I should mention at this point that my friend and I were kind of tipsy, and seeing all these animal carcasses just excited us even more. We got out of the truck and started to walk up to the house. My friend wanted to see the inside of the house, but I wanted to explore the outside a bit more, so I said I would meet him inside. I walked around for a little bit, but it wasn't long until I spotted something that made me run back to the truck. In the yard was a pile of bones. When I first saw it, I thought it was just only animal bones, but upon closer inspection, I swear that I saw human skulls in the pile. I almost vomited, then made for the truck, screaming my friend's name. As soon as I closed the door, my friend came tearing out of the house as fast as he could. He had a look of pure terror and disgust on his face. He jumped in, started the truck, and sped out of there as fast as we could. When we got a little further down the road, he stopped the truck and told me what he saw. In one of the rooms of the house were numerous dead animals nailed to the walls. When he backed out of the room and into the hallway, he looked beside him. He noticed something in the darkness of the far end of the hallway. Standing there was a figure of a very large man. My friend was frozen in terror, and that's when the figure moved towards him, taking giant thudding steps. As the man moved closer, my friend heard the sound of metal dragging across the old floorboards. My friend did not wait to see what the man was dragging behind him, and booked it out of there. We somehow managed to find our way back. I told my friend about what I saw, and we decided to contact the police. But we couldn't remember specific roads we had turned off of, and couldn't give an accurate location. So long story short, there was no follow-up on our report. I don't know what was going on there, but I'm glad we got out of there when we did. I sometimes tell myself that I was just hallucinating when I saw those skulls, but I know deep down that isn't true. It started several years ago. Me and my friends were interested in urban exploration. I was a junior in high school at the time, which was when everyone started to earn a lot more freedom, so we took the chance to be out late whenever we could. Now keep in mind that I live in a major city in central Colorado, so the nightlife is never lacking. We could always find something to do. And we were especially interested if there was an element of danger. We wouldn't always plan these trips, but we made sure as hell that if we were going into an old building in the dark, we would have a knife and a flashlight for safety. We never really had to defend ourselves, but we came very close one evening. It must have been around November, because there wasn't yet snow on the ground, but it was very chilly that evening. Directly across the street from an abandoned hospital is another hospital that is newer and in use. The two are connected by an underground tunnel, which I can only assume was a way to move the bodies without alerting the other patients. This was a common trait among old hospitals. We have been inside the hospital a few times but never found anything strange, only the occasional sign of others having been or lived there. What was piquing our interest that night was the abandoned library next door to that hospital. It was also connected, but only by its exterior walls. To get inside, you could not cut through the hospital, but instead would have to hop over the tall wall and climb a very high fence. A few of us had backpacks containing the aforementioned safety precautions, and a couple of bottles of water, so nothing too heavy or valuable that would get damaged when tossed over the obstacles before us. A little ways off the road, it was dark if you clung to the buildings, We did that for a while, before stepping behind a small patch of shrubbery, which we determined was an easy way over the first wall, since the only other way to gain access was by a chained, unclimbable gate at the bottom of a set of stairs facing away from the ledge. Both were parallel with the library, so when tucked back in that corner behind the bushes, no one could see us from the street. I don't believe I went first, but I did not remain behind to be the last one over the wall. It was too high up for me to jump and haul myself over, so I resorted to stepping on a pipe jutting out somewhere lower along the wall. It gave me a needed boost, and soon I was up and over, moving into the library's courtyard. Another girl and I waited for our other two friends to join us. Upon an initial glance over the courtyard, there was no obvious way in. To our right was a dilapidated fountain, and the earth at our feet was cold and hard. There were no signs of another soul for years, except for the 15-foot chain-link fence directly in front of us, separating the courtyard in half. I could tell it hadn't seen the same weather as the rest of the courtyard, because the metal showed no signs of rust. That must be our way in, we agreed. Because with a fence like that, someone obviously wanted to keep us out. We hurled our bags over the fence, hearing them clank on the ground rather silently, due to their lightness. I was the third over, because I have a slight fear of climbing, and it took me a bit to mentally prepare myself. I made it to the top of the fence in short time, then sat at the top straddling it with a leg on either side. I had two girls on the other side in front of me, and one behind me, telling me to hurry up. I spent a couple of minutes up there doing more mental preparation and some deep breathing, then climbed down to wait for the last girl. At the time, I was thinking that had been one of the scariest things I've done in a while, because I tend to avoid climbing at all costs. Of course, this was only an irrational fear, as I have never fallen, but that phobia didn't even compare to what happened next. The last girl's feet hit the ground, and all four of us split up in the smaller half of the courtyard, looking for any kind of entrance. We decided that breaking a window would be too loud and draw unwanted attention, not to mention we could easily get caught up, so that wasn't an option. Searching for a little longer, we didn't find anything that looked remotely plausible, until we found a grate near the base of where two walls met. I couldn't believe that we hadn't noticed it before, and upon closer inspection, the grate was already moved slightly from its resting place, so it would be easy to lift the rest of the way. The smallest and least fearful of the group went first. After moving the grate, there was a small drop down. It was more than 3 feet down and 2 feet wide, but inside was another drop down, where we could see into the library's basement. She hopped down onto the small, square landing, only to almost immediately freeze. We looked amongst ourselves, wondering what was wrong. "There's a guy down there," she said. "What? Where?" "I can see his outline." I leaned forward and tried to make out a shape, but it was further down than my line of sight permitted, and it was too dark. "Hello?" she called out. He responded the same, asking us who we were. "Just a couple of girls," she spat out nervously. What he said next sent chills down my spine, and it was as if I could feel the darkness resonating out of that hole in the ground. All of a sudden, it was very still and quiet. He said in what I can only describe as a lustful tone, dripping with intent,
"I'm addicted to following the sound of women's voices."
My friend looked over at us blankly, but I could tell she was nervous. Something in his voice sounded like it wasn't an empty threat, like he wasn't just saying something creepy just to get us to leave. She looked back down to where he was and said, "That's not cool." The man started laughing maniacally. It wasn't in the way a really good actor does. It was in the way that we could feel his utter insanity hit us like stale air. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but I knew it was only a couple of seconds, because we all knew without saying anything that we had to get out of there. And now, I wasn't about to risk some nutcase coming after us, even if we did outnumber him. My friend scrambled up out of the landing, and I was never over a fence faster in my life. 15-foot potential fall, and I didn't even have time to think about it. We didn't stop running until we were all in the street and halfway down the block out of breath. Even to this day, I can still hear that man's laughing. the mid-1980s, my mom was a cleaner in Australia. She would do houses in suburban areas, and sometimes would go out to houses in rural or wine areas. We lived near both. She would leave business cards at the local shops, and she got most of her business that way, and some through referrals and word of mouth. One day she got a call from a lady who sounded like she was around 60, asking Mom to clean her old farmhouse. She made lots of odd demands, and Mom would usually meet clients before taking on new business. In this case, the lady did not want to meet Mom and said that she would leave the keys under the front doormat. Mom agreed, mainly because this lady was quite obviously wealthy and was offering to pay Mom substantially more than she would expect. Mom went to the house on a Monday morning and said that she already felt unnerved by the long driveway. The house was essentially in the middle of a very large and very empty property. She found the keys and started cleaning. About an hour into the cleaning, she hears the back door shut. Mom was told that no one would be at the house, so she immediately felt unsafe. She stood frozen in the kitchen for what she said felt like 3 to 4 minutes. Although she said it could have been much longer, there was no other car on the property. She wanted to leave immediately but had 2 more rooms left to do. Both were bedrooms. She said as time passed that she heard nothing else. She decided that perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps something had fallen, and it wasn't the door after all. She walked up the hallway and stepped into the bedroom. All over the bed were black and white photos. As Mom got closer, she realized that the photos were all of her. Some were taken at her family home, and many others were taken at houses Mom would clean, some through windows or over fences. She used the house phone to call the police and immediately drove to the end of the driveway. The lady ended up being investigated, but continued to claim that it was a break-in. After some time, the police stopped with their searching, and we ended up moving to a new town 4 months later. Every time Mom tells me the story, I get serious chills. My mom thinks that the lady had something to do with it, but why? And for what purpose? I am 22 and this incident happened a year and a half ago. I had just moved into my first apartment. The door that led to my apartment locks itself automatically when closed, so I was going to the entrance of the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed while opening the mail and using the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still, with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I couldn't see his face. He didn't see me. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts were rushing through my head, I picked up the phone and said, "Sorry, I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back." The bathroom was right next to my bed, so I quickly walked in, quietly locked the door, and turned the shower on. My apartment was on the first floor, so I jumped out of my window and then called the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone comes out of the door to the apartment complex. This was during the summer, and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car, while watching my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend, and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that stood beside me while the other cops searched through my house told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives and was waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept in my entry door, and while I was getting my mail, hid under the bed. The man was trying to hurt me and turned out to be a homeless person and ended up being placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. I wanted to share my story so that others might know what to do if they find themselves in a situation like this. The police told me that what I did was truly amazing and rational, and if I screamed, this could have ended really badly for me. This is a popular story with my family and most of my friends. Amanda is my brother's girlfriend, and at the time of this story, She was looking for her first apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together just yet, since they had only been dating for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled, "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." This sort of thing was common, since the area that she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap compared to most places listed. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that was not comfortable living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this place. However, the listing only had a single photo from outside the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she receives an email back with all the details and time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by around 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there was a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken, use back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkept. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door, an older man opens the door. At first, Amanda thinks that she's at the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant was out and that he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. There was no furniture. There was nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping lights on for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments. There was a single room that the landlord would not open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walk down the hallway and into the living room, she notices that the front door has a plank nailed across it. Amanda's creepometer had started dinging, so she decides to wrap things up, but trying to be polite. As she's telling the guy, "Thanks for showing me around," he perks up and states that he forgot to show her the basement, that it was recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and that she should take a look down there. Amanda and the landlord are standing in a small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen. In this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward, creating a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles and motions to the stairs and says,
"Ladies first."
What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda got a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah? Are you here? I'll come out from around back and let you in. It's great. You have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks out of the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told my mother and my brother everything. The cops were called. They took her statement and went to investigate. The Craigslist ad had been removed. The house had been foreclosed upon over 6 months earlier, and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room that the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gasoline jugs everywhere. What was even more creepy was that he had plastered ripped up pages from porno magazines on all the walls in the room. The really scary part was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs about halfway down. The basement was empty except for another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped up in leather belts, and a small box with a few rolls of assorted tape. Needless to say, Amanda ended up not moving in. Several years ago, I went on a carnival cruise with my best friend. I was 30 at the time, and I had just had my heart broken after my fiancé had canceled our wedding, having admitted he only proposed to me to make some other girl jealous. I had just spent a small fortune on a full back tattoo of angel wings, and I had intended to flaunt them around shamelessly. My friend and I spent most of our time out on the sun deck, catching some rays and working on our tan, more often than not drinking whatever alcoholic beverage was closest at hand. My friend was determined to get me laid, as I had been faithful to my ex-fiancée for over 3 years, and she wanted me to immediately jump back into the game. I was pretty indifferent towards that idea, mostly because I was really enjoying the feeling of being free and detached, but I told her if she found a candidate, I would consider him. For the first few days, she didn't mention it, but on the 4th day she pointed out a guy who looked close to 40, with a well-kept beard, and get this, an eye patch, but he had the body of an athlete and reminded me of a young Kurt Russell. At first, I was ready to dismiss him out of hand, because of the eye patch alone. Simply, it's not something I look for, but my friend kept insisting he was checking out my back tattoo as he walked back and forth across the deck. We never saw him with any other girls, and my friend kept insinuating he may have been a veteran, freshly back from duty and looking to get laid. I only made eye contact with him once, and he smiled and nodded in a warm and courteous way. I nodded back, but ultimately decided that even though he seemed like he would certainly help me forget about my ex, I wasn't interested enough to pursue it any further. I told my friend that he was all hers. The next day, I hit the hot tub by myself. I had my head back and was more or less zoned out. My eyes were closed and I was enjoying the blissful relaxation when I felt something poke into my stomach. I opened my eyes and noticed a single rose floating in the hot tub with me. Its stem was poking at me as it bobbed up and down. I glanced around, and there was plenty of people nearby, but on the complete opposite end of the deck, I noticed the eye patch guy was staring at me as he sat alone at a table. He waved at me, and I tossed the rose out of the water and climbed out, ignoring him. As I wrapped a towel around myself, I was annoyed. Looking back, that seemed like a stupid thing to do. The rose had thorns and they could have stuck me. Why not just drop the pellets in the tub, or leave the rose on my towel? Those both seemed like much more romantic gestures, even though they really wouldn't have impressed me much anyway. I figured that my friend must have colluded with him to play a joke on me, and I forgot the whole thing. I didn't see him again that day, or any of the next, though I mostly spent the time in my room. On the second to last day of the cruise, I was eating breakfast in the dining area when I felt a pair of hands start massaging my shoulders, and a voice behind me said,
"There's my angel."
It was the eye patch man. I leapt up and smacked his hands away, which caught the attention of several people sitting nearby. I told him to back off and to never touch me again. Then I stormed out of the dining room. I confronted my friend and told her to reel in her new boy toy, as he was starting to act way too familiar with me. She looked at me and told me that she had never once spoken to that guy. Knowing that she wouldn't lie to me, my stomach sank, and suddenly I felt very uncomfortable. Deciding not to go anywhere else alone for the remainder of the cruise, my friend and I stayed close together and enjoyed the rest of our day. After dinner, we returned to our cabin to notice a line had been drawn across the outer door frame in black marker, which I thought was weird, but was too buzzed to comment on. I stripped off my clothes and climbed into bed, and within 5 minutes I had passed out. I woke up already feeling the start of a hangover setting in, maybe around 40 minutes later. My friend was asleep in the bed next to me, and I was convinced that I heard a noise coming from the other side of the door. I got up to walk across the room to glance out the peephole, and noticed the eye patch man was right outside our door, and was fiddling with the handle. There was a small globe sitting on the table next to the door, with a heavy brass stand. It was meant to be a paperweight, but it also served as a mini lockbox which held my license, passport, and car keys. Without hesitating, I picked it up, flung the door open, and even before he could get a good look at my birthday suit, I smashed him directly in the face with the globe, right under his good eye. He cursed loud enough to be heard across the boat and took off running. I slammed the door, locked it, set the globe down, and got back into bed. I was asleep maybe 10 minutes later, and my friend never even stirred. The next day after we docked, I noticed him on the gangway, but he didn't even see me. He was bandaged up pretty good, and it looked like I had possibly broken his nose. My friend and I laughed our asses off on the ride home, and that's the story of how I knocked some sense into some creepy one-eyed stalker by stepping up and being my own guardian angel. I guess I'll never know exactly what his deal was, and I'm still not entirely sure if the marker on the door had anything to do with him, though the rooms did have numbers too, so who knows. I'm sure there's perfectly nice guys out there with eye patches, but this guy did not help the stereotype. Back in the second week of September, I took a short vacation to Hawaii with my boyfriend. The trip was very important to us because it was the only time both of us could arrange our work schedules to get off at the same time. Overall, the trip was incredibly fun and worthwhile, and we made the most of it by visiting Pearl Harbor, the Stairway to Heaven, and the Kona Brewery. We even got some skydiving in, which is something I'm very proud of myself for experiencing. We stayed at an Airbnb on the top floor of a high-rise with a spectacular view of the city, and we practically felt like we were living in our own private slice of the sky. Well, perhaps we shouldn't have felt so untouchable. On the second or third day of the trip there, we were enjoying a relaxing morning of testing the mattress. The curtains were wide open and the sun was pouring in. Our sensual bliss was suddenly interrupted when my boyfriend looked towards the window. Babe, there's someone out there." "Out where?" I turned my head towards the window, and I felt my insides shrivel away and die. There was a man with a dark tan standing outside on a platform, staring right in at us, not even pretending not to notice what we were doing. Had I ingested enough booze, I may have just laughed and waved at him, but it was too early in the morning, and mortified I hid under the covers while my boyfriend walked over and shut the curtains. Needless to say, it killed the mood. Killed it so badly, in fact, it was dead and buried about 10 feet beneath Moses. For a few awful minutes of shock and embarrassment, 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Like how long he had been out there. Was he recording anything? But most important of all, what was he doing out there? My boyfriend and I eventually made peace with the idea that he was probably a window washer or something, and we had just been unlucky. Had this been a hotel, we probably could have called down to the front desk and complained. But it was an Airbnb rental, and technically a private residence there. There was nothing we could do except laugh and shrug it off, which was exactly what we ended up doing. We eventually left the room and went about our day and had a great time, and I can honestly say I didn't think twice about the guy all day, as we enjoyed the sights and each other's company. And when we got back to the room, we picked up where we left off and had a good night's sleep. The following day, we spent some time on the beach, but instead of heading directly back to the room afterwards, we went directly up to the roof of our building to see the view and take selfies. We took loads of pictures, watched planes take off and land from the airport in the distance, and overall just enjoyed the sensation of being young, in love, and in Hawaii. That's when, yet again, the moment was ruined. My boyfriend was out closer to the edge of the building, trying to get the best shot possible of the city, and I was sitting closer to the access door, enjoying the sun and minding my own business, when I heard the door swing open, and I glanced over. The exact same guy who had been outside our window gave me a crooked smile, nodded and disappeared through the door and down the stairs, the door closing behind him before I could find my voice. My blood froze. Had that really just happened? How long had that guy been up there on the roof with us? What was he even doing up here? He wasn't dressed as a maintenance guy. And what's more, his right foot had been encased in one of those medical boots, which implied he wasn't working in any capacity. I had noticed it the other day when I made eye contact with him through the window. Part of me just wanted to run after him and grab him by the throat and ask him what the heck he was doing stalking us like that. But I'm a pretty small person, and realistically acting like that would have probably ended worse for me than him. I called my boyfriend over and gave him the rundown on what had just happened. He booked it over to the door and looked down the stairway, but the guy was already gone. What do you think he was doing? We'll report him to the security guard downstairs in the lobby. He probably lives in the building. But then we would have to admit that we were up here on the roof too, Eventually, we just went back to the room without reporting him. We locked up our door tight, and the rest of our evening passed without incident. The next morning around 6 a.m. I woke up, rolled over in bed, and tried to fall back asleep. After maybe 5 minutes of just lying there quietly, I began to hear a noise coming from the outside hallway, through the living room. I sat up in bed and listened. There was a shuffling sound, and I wondered if some building administrator was sliding something underneath the door. Then I felt the door handle jiggle, and I suddenly was terrified. Like I said, this wasn't a hotel where room service may have just mistakenly been stopping by. This was supposed to be a private residence. I got out of bed without waking my boyfriend and crossed the living room to the front door. Outside, I suddenly heard the shuffling stop, and then there came the sound of soft, uneven footsteps heading down the hallway. I braced myself, looked out the peephole, but I didn't see anything. Had the person outside heard me coming? I double-checked the locks and headed back into the bedroom. The uneven footsteps unnerved me quite a bit, because all I could picture was the prowler guy trying to get in and possibly get a closer look at my boyfriend and I in bed. Despite my unease, I fell back asleep after about maybe 10 minutes. I woke up again around 7:30. There was much more sunlight in the room. My boyfriend was awake and on his phone. I kissed him good morning and made to get out of bed. "Hey, did you hear anything weird last night?" He glanced over to me, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes. "Not last night, but I woke up about 15 minutes ago to the sound of tapping on the window." My stomach sank. I stared at my boyfriend for a moment, and then we both climbed out of bed and threw back the curtains. I gasped and I covered my mouth. There were 2 faint handprints pressed against the outside of the glass, right about the spot where the curtains were closed, which implied to me that he had pressed himself against the window and tried to peek in, possibly without any harness. Just to get a look inside our bedroom terrified me. My boyfriend and I immediately went downstairs and told security, who obviously didn't believe us until we asked them to take a look at the handprints. We told them everything about the man in the boot watching us, and even us being up on the roof. After about a 40-minute conversation with security, we left to get some breakfast, and we never saw that guy again. I'm not sure if the building's security ever found him and put a stop to it, or he just stopped on his own, but we were fortunate enough to be able to enjoy the rest of our trip without incident. We even left a shining online review for Airbnb. While I'm still slightly creeped out, I'm so glad I got to spend some time in Hawaii with my boyfriend, and I don't regret the trip at all. This guy in the boot has given me a creepy story I can tell for years. Don't let this one random guy dissuade you from vacationing in Hawaii. It's well worth the trip. I would vacation there again and even stay in the same room. But if there ever comes a day where I read online that a guy fell to his death outside that building, I wouldn't be surprised, and I won't have to look at the picture to know who it is. I was roughly 8 or 9 at the time of this incident. I remember the attachable LCD screen for the PS1 had just come out, which would put this around 2001. My mother, older brother, and I took a trip one afternoon to our local Toys R Us. My brother and I would typically skip the rest of the store and head straight for the video game section. I guess my mom thought the store was safe enough to leave us in that area while she looked around. The section was well lit and had its own checkout counter and attendants. It would have been very stupid for a potential creeper to attempt to grab a kid under those circumstances, but some of these sickos tend to premeditate about all of this. So my brother and I split up to check out the newest games, and after a few minutes I noticed that someone was talking to my brother, someone who definitely was not an employee. He was a tall Caucasian guy with a slim build, gray hair, buzz cut, and seemed to be in his 40s or 50s. They talked for a bit and then the guy went about his business. I went up to my brother and asked him what the man wanted. My brother was more quiet than usual and simply stated that the man had offered to buy him anything he wanted from the store if he did the man a favor in return. When I asked what that was, my brother did not respond. As a kid, I guess I couldn't fathom the man's true intentions and merely thought he genuinely was going to buy a gift and leave us alone forever. The only thing running through my head was to grab the most expensive game console and find the guy again. I was very naive. Anyways, my brother knew better. He grabbed my arm and told me to forget about it. As we walked towards the car a little while later, I looked at the adjacent street and spotted the man. I pointed towards him and told my mom about what happened. He was staring right back at us as he drove away in his Jeep, possibly still reeling from almost getting caught. Looking back, I'm glad the man hadn't approached me instead. Last Thanksgiving, my boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into our car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. Being new parents, we were extremely nervous about taking such a lengthy trip with the baby and packed for every possible scenario. We left shortly after 12, my boyfriend behind the wheel, and we hit the highway, which was swollen with holiday traffic. After about an hour of driving, the baby became fussy, and we pulled over at a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was changing her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching, and suddenly called my name. Peering outside the car, I looked across the street in the direction he was pointing. There was a clown with a purple star painted over his face, and wild, crazy, unkempt black hair, and a purple and white checkered outfit standing on the opposite side of the parking lot, just waving to people as they pulled in and out of the rest stop. I chuckled and returned to what I was doing, unbothered by the clown, figuring it was just part of some kind of promotion. As we pulled out of the station, the clown waved at us, and I gave a lazy acknowledgement back. Just before my boyfriend took his foot off the brake and eased into traffic, the clown gave me the most hungry, sinister smile I had ever seen, and shouted,
"You would look amazing draped over my lap."
Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly, and said, "Wow, what a creep." As we drove away, I repeated what the clown had said to my boyfriend, who hadn't quite heard it, and for a few minutes he was dead set on turning around to confront him. But I told him it wasn't worth it, as we still had a long drive ahead of us. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30, and by then, I had already forgotten about the incident and didn't even bring it up to my parents. We had a great time at my parents' place, and ended up leaving close to 11:30 at night, much later than we had intended to. My parents tried to convince us to stay, and while we had plenty of stuff for the baby, we hadn't packed any overnight things for ourselves. So we decided just to commit to the drive. We figured that there would be a lot less traffic, and it would take a shorter amount of time to get home. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked me if I wouldn't mind taking over, as he was having a hard time keeping his eyes focused. I told him to pull over at the next rest area, and I would take the wheel. After a few minutes, we see a sign for a rest area and pull into it. It wasn't the same rest stop as before. It had no bathrooms, vending machines, or anything. It was basically just a long parking lot, with one row of parking spaces which looped back onto the road. My boyfriend pulled the car into a spot, nose first, so it was facing a long chain link fence, and beyond it, there was just trees and a swamp. I couldn't see anything specific in the glow of the headlights. He put the car in park and left the engine running, and the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. The baby started to fuss as soon as the car stopped moving, and after I climbed out of the passenger seat, I opened the back door to check on her. My boyfriend climbed into the passenger seat and immediately shut his eyes. After I confirmed that the baby was fine and would probably fall back asleep when we started driving again, I shut the back door and made my way to the driver's seat. That's when I heard the sound of the chain link fence rattling and something being dragged across the metal links, steadily drawing closer. I turned in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I only noticed the dark outline of a figure on the opposite side of the fence, until they stepped into the light of our headlights. It was the exact same clown from the other rest stop, except this time he had a large red stain splattered across his purple and white costume, and was dragging a broken beer bottle across the fence. He pressed his face directly into the gaps in the fence and smiled at me. He cackled,
"Hello again,"
and started making lewd gestures with his tongue. I was at a loss for words. It was so unbelievably surreal that I could only stare at him in disbelief and horror, not knowing whether I should be truly afraid or start laughing at the absurdity of it. My boyfriend launched himself out of the passenger seat and screamed, "Get in the car!" When he opened his car door, The baby started crying out, and the sound could be heard across the silent parking lot, and the clown immediately started singing in a grotesque, uneven voice.
Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the clown comes, the cradle will rock.
My parents had given us a set of fancy glasses for our dining room table. My boyfriend launched one directly at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain link fence and sprayed tiny razor projectiles all over. The clown hissed and immediately booked it to the end of the fence. My boyfriend and I jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the spot, and as we put the car in drive, we saw the clown charging towards us across the parking lot. My boyfriend yelled at me to hit him, but I swerved to avoid him and floored it out of the lot and back onto the highway. For the next several minutes, my heart was racing, convinced that at any moment a speeding car would come up behind us and try to run us off the road. But fortunately, that never happened. We were so shaken and traumatized that all we could do for the rest of the way home was ask each other over and over again, what the heck just happened? We could only speculate what the guy was doing out there at 12 a.m., dressed like a clown in the middle of the Everglades on Thanksgiving night. We considered that he was just trying to mess with people. But you would need some serious balls to pull that kind of stunt out there in the Everglades. The people that live around there don't put up with that kind of nonsense. And what was he even doing there? Just hiding behind the dark fence for a completely random car to show up so he could traumatize them? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we felt justified throwing something at him. And seeing as how his response was to charge us, I suspect that his intentions were hostile. The fact that we had seen him earlier that day made the situation even worse, because it felt like he was stalking us. My boyfriend had a license to carry a gun, so all I can say is, it's a good thing that he wasn't packing that particular night. This Thanksgiving, we planned to stay home. Back during the height of the 2016 clown craze, where psychos were dressing up and wandering around rural and wooded areas, stalking and terrifying people, I was living in a very isolated and heavily wooded property in Connecticut. My driveway was so long that my house could not be seen from the road, and I never once had a problem with trespassers, so my kids were free to play outside in our yard whenever they wished. One afternoon, I was inside the house on a conference call when my 8-year-old daughter ran into the house, stating that there was a clown in our driveway. For the first several seconds, I was annoyed, because I was convinced she was either playing a joke on me or just seeing things. I excused myself from the call and asked her what she was doing there, and she simply replied, "It's pointing at us." Something in the way she said that made a chill run through me, and I stood up and walked out of the front door and onto the front steps. My daughter pointed and I saw a figure in a pink and blue striped outfit, standing by the tree line, waving and pointing towards my other 2 children, who were still close to the house, but calling over to the clown, asking what it wanted. I immediately called my kids inside and locked my front door. I told them to stay put, grabbed my stun gun from its spot, and got into my car. I called my husband as I drove the car out of the garage and down the driveway, telling him what was going on, and he told me to keep the car doors locked and not to get too close. I decided, at least for the time being, not to call the police, because it would have taken them a good half an hour just to get there, and by then, the clown would likely be gone. I didn't just want to disappear into the house and wait for this person to get bored. I wanted to confront him and tell him to stay away from my property and from my kids. The clown wasn't by the tree line when I left the garage, but I drove down the driveway, into the trees a short way, and saw him jogging away at a brisk pace. When he heard my car coming, he stopped and turned around and looked back towards me. He wasn't wearing a mask, but his face was heavily made up, complete with a clown nose. But what really shook me was that he appeared to be holding a croquet mallet in one of his hands. He waved at me before disappearing into the woods, and I slammed on my brakes and rolled down my window halfway, screaming at him to get the hell off my property. I floored it to the end of my driveway and drove back and forth in the hopes of finding a parked car with a license plate I could report. but there wasn't anything suspicious or out of place. I returned to the house to check on my kids, who were more amused and excited than afraid. Inwardly, I kicked myself for not taking a picture of the clown on my phone, just to have a record of it in case I needed to report it. I told my kids they had to stay inside for the rest of the day and figured that I would never see the clown again. Whoever it was had gotten his kicks and certainly would not risk trespassing on my property again. The kids were asleep, and my husband and I were skimming through Netflix, and I got up to let the cat out. I'm not exactly positive on what I saw, but there was definitely something across the yard. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye and thought I saw the shadow of something cast by the moon disappearing around the corner. I turned on all the outside lights, and my husband and I looked around, but whatever it was did not reappear. It could have been a deer, I suppose, but the reason I suspect it was the clown was because of the following morning. When I drove my car to the end of the driveway, there was a purple balloon tied to our mailbox, and the little potted plant at the base of the post had been smashed, as if something big, like a mallet, had come down on it. Worried that the balloon was an indicator of some kind, I immediately untied it. The rest of that day passed without incident, and by the following afternoon, I'd forgotten all about the clown until my kids came back inside and told me he was back and pointing at them again. I yelled at the kids to come inside, but this time, instead of getting in the car, I grabbed my phone and stun gun and stupidly charged out of the front door and stomped across the yard, determined to get a picture this time, and at best stun him and hold him down until the cops came and dragged his ass away. I never saw him that time, and instead of just keeping my kids shut inside, I loaded them in the car and drove to my parents'. This time they were a little more spooked by the clown, and I began to become concerned that perhaps my kids were not safe in the yard anymore. I asked them if it was the same clown, and they said it was, and this time he was holding a sledgehammer. I don't know if that was true, or if they were just misidentifying the croquet mallet. The following day, I decided to become a little more proactive. My parents let me borrow their black Labrador named Groucho. He was a friendly dog, but had a tremendously loud bark and was fiercely protective of the kids. For 2 days, nothing happened, and I was starting to hope that the clown had moved on to harass someone else. That's when it happened. I was returning back up the driveway in the car after getting the mail when I noticed the clown was sneaking through the woods. Groucho was in the back seat and immediately started barking loud enough to rupture my eardrums. I slammed on my brakes and immediately called the cops and told them that there was a trespasser on my property and he was carrying a weapon. I honestly couldn't tell if he was carrying the croquet mallet through the trees, but I know he had been carrying one before, so I felt I had a reasonable cause to assume. As I was on the phone with the cops, another call came in on my cell from the house. My oldest daughter was crying, saying that there was a clown standing on our back deck, right outside the sliding door. This one was dressed all in orange, with a blue face. I floored it back up the driveway, threw my car into park, and when I reached the garage, I saw the second clown sprinting towards the woods. I opened the rear door, and Groucho tore after the guy like a ballistic missile. He caught the clown right by the tree line, and the guy started screaming as the loyal dog leapt on top of him and tore at his costume. I distinctly heard 2 separate male voices yelling in the trees, though I couldn't make out exactly what was being said. My daughter was still on the line and confirmed to me that all the kids were still inside, so I went after my dog into the woods. When I found Groucho, he was limping slightly. I was infuriated to see that he had been stabbed with what could have been an ice pick or a screwdriver, but he ultimately seemed unbothered by it. When the cops arrived, I gave them my statement, and they searched the woods. About an hour later, I got a call saying that 2 men had been pulled over and arrested several miles away for reckless driving, and one of them had severe dog bites on both legs. Groucho went to the vet and got bandaged up, and fortunately he has been perfectly fine ever since. I never heard any follow-up pertaining to the arrest afterwards, but the whole situation still amazes me. Getting to our house through the woods isn't an easy 2-minute hike, These men had to walk a good 10 to 15 minutes through the thick forest in full clown makeup just to get close enough to see our house, all for the sake of pranking and terrorizing my family, who was just minding their own business. Their motives were completely lost on me, and the more research I did on this whole clown thing, the more I think it was some kind of test or initiation, and not just something bored people were doing to pass the time. They put real effort into stalking us, and ultimately were rewarded with a dog attack. I think they got lucky. Fortunately, I've never seen another trespasser on my property since.
There's always a reason to be afraid.